This is the second module for Cultural Dimensions of Health, and today the module is on cultural systems of knowledge and practice, morality, and mental health. I want to start here by showing you a piece of art. The picture here is of a retablo, or a miniature sculpture scene by Nicario Jimenez, depicting the contrast between folk and modern medicine as practiced in his home country of Peru. The artist explained that he was interested in depicting this because his grandfather had been a curandero, or a traditional healer. And by comparing the upper and lower level scenes in this retablo, we can understand that we're looking at two very different cultural systems of healing based on different understandings of the nature of illness and what should be done about it. We can refer to these as ethnomedical systems. If you recall from last week in our explanation of the term ethnography, we said that the prefix ethno refers to culture. So here we're talking about cultural medical systems, or cultural systems of health and knowledge, health knowledge and practice rather, that do several things. They define the kinds of illnesses that can exist and what these illnesses are called. In other words, what constellations of signs and symptoms would be recognized as a distinct illness or an aberration from the normal healthy state within that particular cultural context. Ethnomedical systems also define the factors that cause the illnesses. Do we believe that illnesses are caused by biological pathogens, for example, or by spirits, or imbalances in some kind of a system, social violations? What is it that causes people to become sick? And it links these causal factors to the types of illnesses, therefore categorizing them as in a typology. The ethnomedical system also then defines the treatments that are considered appropriate for illnesses based on the identified causes. If you believe that illness is caused by pathogens entering the body, then your treatment will do something in order to address the action or the presence of those pathogens. If you believe that illness is caused by the action of an evil spirit, then your treatment would somehow involve counteracting or immobilizing that spirit. And finally, the ethnomedical system links types of healers to the treatments that people can undergo. I want to look in a little bit more detail at some of these scenes because they're very detailed and very interesting in terms of these characteristics of an ethnomedical system. So look at this illustration of the ethnomedical system, which we could describe really as the system known as curanderismo, which Edberg describes on page 31 of your textbook. I'm just going to read the description from your textbook now. He says it's found in many parts of Central and Latin America. A healer or curandero makes a diagnosis using tarot type cards or by sweeping a broken egg or other object across the body of the patient. The idea is that there is a supreme or higher power that is the source of energy, and the curandero is simply the instrument of that higher power, and is a person trained to restore balance to the patient. The healer intercedes in the world of the divine, accessing the energy to restore health, using chants, prayers, imagery, and specific cures. The healer also focuses on restoring balance in the patient's social and family relations. For those of you who can read Spanish, I've transcribed some of the posters that are on the walls in this scene so that we can make out what services are being advertised. This is from the upper left room in the overall picture that was on the previous slide. And we can see the curanderos are telling the future or making diagnoses by reading tarot cards, reading palms, reading coca leaves. And the orange poster also alludes to the preparation of love potions as part of the many services offered by this healer. While in the next room, a man is propped up on a table surrounded by candles, skulls, and various pots and vessels. While on the floor beside him, a woman is receiving a kind of floral bath. You can see the flowers that are stuck onto her body. And I've transcribed the poster above the floral bath, which says, specialists in flower baths for business, home, cars, study, travel, and bodily sickness. So the treatments that are being practiced here are very colorful, to the uninitiated very exotic seeming, but also the conception of what might even bring somebody to seek the help of a curandero is culturally significant. Bodily ailments sit alongside, and in fact are right at the end of a long list of various aspects of life, including one's love life, that might bring somebody into this healing setting in order to seek treatment. This points to one of the really important take-home messages for this week's module, that one of the key aspects of a cultural or ethno-medical system is that it provides an understanding of what can go wrong, what it means to be well or unwell within a particular cultural context. Certain signs and symptoms might be recognized as illness in one ethno-medical system, but not necessarily in others. So as we are practicing public health in multicultural or global contexts, almost certainly we're going to encounter people whose notion of what constitutes an illness, what it means to be sick, what things we should be worried about, will not necessarily be the same as that of the public health practitioner. And so there will be a need for cross-cultural communication in order to address, identify first of all, and then address perhaps any differences that there might be in one's understanding of what illnesses actually will be recognized as illnesses needing treatment or prevention. Now, in contrast to the curanderos that we saw in the last two slides, let's notice what we see in the modern hospital scenes. The ethno-medical system being represented here is perhaps more familiar to us. It's a system known as biomedicine, and this is also described by Edberg on page 31 in your textbook. So in this system, illness classification is tied to biological phenomena. We can see this in the actions of pathogens. So in the upper left room, notice that there's an anti-dengue mosquito poster above the desk. So there's a very particular biological pathogen mechanism understanding of what causes the dengue fever, that it's the dengue virus, which is transmitted through the vector of a mosquito. Also, it's a little bit harder to see in detail in this picture, but in the upper right room on the wall there's a hand washing poster which is asking people to wash their hands in order to combat diarrhea. It might also consider cellular or other biomechanical malfunctions. Note the imaging technologies being used in the lower left room. Injuries or systems damage and others. So here, only these bodily malfunctions are understood as illnesses that can be treated by the specialists who work here. And they dress, note the white lab coats, note the blue scrubs in the operating room. They dress and behave in particular ways that are culturally understood within this ethno-medical system to be integral to the healing process. Here's a very different kind of doctor from the ones depicted in the hospital scenes of the last slide. This is a witch doctor, as photographed and described by British anthropologist E. Evans Pritchard, working in the South Sudan around the 1930s. I'll come back to what's happening in this picture in just a minute. But I want to draw your attention to a typology, or a way of classifying non-Western medical systems that was described by an anthropologist called George Foster in the 1970s, and this is discussed in your textbook. And Foster distinguished between what he calls personalistic and naturalistic ethno-medical systems, where in a personalistic ethno-medical system, disease is thought to be due to the active purposeful intervention of an agent, as in a sorcerer, a spirit, etc. So the sick person is an object of action, and the cure is a countervailing action against that person or spirit who caused the illness to occur. The countervailing action doesn't necessarily need to take place within the landscape of the particular person who's ill, because they're almost incidental to the illness. They're the site of an action which caused the illness. On the other hand, a naturalistic ethnomedical system explains disease by the impersonal actions of systems, which, according to Foster, are usually based on old historical systems of the great civilizations. So we're talking about things like yin and yang balance, hot and cold systems, which are still prevalent in a lot of Latin American ethnomedical beliefs. So the cure for a naturalistic ethnomedical system is to restore balance or system equilibrium. And we could think of Western biomedicine as a type of naturalistic ethnomedical system also. I want to talk for just a minute about the personalistic ethnomedical systems, because this way of thinking about illness and healing is quite easily misunderstood and might seem to be the most different from our own and perhaps even irrational. The picture here, as I mentioned, was taken by a well-known British anthropologist, E. Evans Pritchard, around 1930, in the classic ethnography. Remember, an ethnography is just writing about a culture, entitled Witchcraft, Oracles, and Magic Among the Azande. In this book, Evans Pritchard describes how the Zande people of southern Sudan believed in sorcery and witchcraft as an explanation for all sorts of misfortunes, including illnesses that occurred. Thus, the actions of a witch needed to be counteracted in order to bring an end to the misfortune or bring about healing. So this picture shows a witch doctor dance in which the witch doctor communicates with spirits in order to ascertain whether witchcraft has taken place and to counteract it if so. So it's a personalistic system. Illness is brought about by the malevolent action of another person, the witch. So it should be dealt with by counteracting the witch's actions. And note that the healing activities here don't necessarily take place around the sick person at all, which might seem very strange to modern Westerners. And perhaps you're asking yourself, well, didn't the Zande understand that the true causes of illness might be injuries or germs? It wasn't witchcraft. So that's the point I want to address here, because Evans Pritchard addresses this point really eloquently by pointing out that there are actually different levels of causation that human beings seek to understand. There are natural causes. For example, if you injure yourself by an accident, that can lead to infection, which can make you sick. But knowing these natural mechanisms doesn't answer the more fundamental questions of why did this accident happen to this particular person at this particular time? Or why did this injury go on to become infected when others didn't? The Azande believe in witchcraft, not because they lack awareness of the natural causes of illness, but because this personalistic explanation helps to answer the why me questions. They understand that you can stub your toe and injure your foot, and the foot can become infected. But that doesn't explain why did this person stub their toe at that particular time, or why was the object that they stubbed their toe on in their path at that particular time. And why did this one go on to become infected? Why me? Why this person? It's based on a very different system of knowledge from modern science, yes, but we can see that there is an underlying logic to it, and that it's seeking to answer questions that scientific epidemiology has also struggled with. And arguably, the belief in witchcraft provides a more satisfying answer than the probabilistic explanations that science tends to offer us. Furthermore, Evans Pritchard argued that Belief in witchcraft fills an important social function in Zande society by giving people a way to resolve social tensions through assigning blame in a way that, crucially, can be cured, because there are rituals that can be used to enable a witch to be reconciled with their victim and for the substance of witchcraft to be removed. I'm going to place an excerpt from this classic ethnographic text onto Moodle so that you can read it if you're interested in learning more about witchcraft and witch doctors among the Azande people. It's not required reading, but for those of you who are interested in learning more about these kinds of ethnomedical systems, it will be there. Remember we said last week that culture is both learned and shared among groups of people, and that culture links beliefs or knowledge with practice. So, in the case of ethnomedical systems, culture is not just about how we treat illness, although obviously that's a matter of great importance, but also what we believe about health and illness. And Ed Berg points out on page 32 that an ethnomedical system not only reflects beliefs, but it can also produce or generate beliefs over time. That is, when we're taught to understand illness in a particular way, as we are when we come up through a culture that has a particular ethnomedical system, we're more likely to see the illness manifestations that we have been taught to recognize. This phenomenon has been called the nocebo effect. So whereas the better-known placebo effect refers to the beneficial or healing effects of a patient's belief and expectation, the nocebo effect refers to the ways that belief and expectation can actually create an experience of illness. The significance of belief is extremely important to our study of ethnomedical systems, and there's still much about the links between belief and healing that researchers are still trying to understand. Belief is reinforced during the ethnomedical healing process, often by the use of symbols. So what do I mean by symbols here? I mean things that can be visually or physically perceived and manipulated that represent some underlying reality of the illness and the healing process. So by manipulating physical or visual symbols, it's possible for the healer to communicate meaning about the removal of illness or the treatment of illness going through a healing process, which the patient will understand and their body will somehow respond to. So each of the images in this slide depict a healer and the symbols that are significant in that healer's ethnomedical system. The stethoscope, the white coat, what do these symbolize? The amulets, the sign of the cross, all of these are symbolic of something that healers and patients will recognize and respond to. Now I've placed another kind of classic anthropological text onto the additional readings for those of you who are interested in learning more about how anthropologists have described the relationship between belief and healing. You don't have to read it, but I will just describe a little bit of this case study because it's very interesting. It's the reading by Claude Lévi-Strauss called The Sorcerer and His Magic. And in this chapter, he describes the fascinating case of Keselid, who was a Kwakiutl Indian from the Vancouver region of Canada. And Keselid was very skeptical of his own tribe's tradition of shamanic healing. He thought this was nonsense, and so he sought training in this tradition in order to debunk it. And in his training, he learned a technique in which the shaman would hide a little piece of feather in his mouth and then either bite his tongue or make his gums bleed in order to make the feather covered with blood. And then at the culmination of various songs, rituals, manipulations of the body of the patient, the shaman produces this bloody feather and says, "This is a manifestation of the sickness which I've now sucked out of your body. It's been removed from the patient's body." learning this technique seemed to provide the proof that PHLT was looking for, that the shamans were nothing but charlatans. It was just a trick. They made this feather bloody and produced it at just the right moment in order to tell the patient that they'd been cured. That was all it was. But something kind of strange happened. As he learned to perfect this technique, PHLT actually became very successful at healing people. People really did get better when they had undergone this charlatan treatment. And furthermore, PHLT developed a reputation as being a very gifted healer, and he was invited to go and visit a neighboring tribe where the shamans didn't use that feather technique. And what he found was that he was able to cure patients where the other shamans had failed. So somehow, the symbolism of the bloody feather as the illness being removed from the body, somehow the symbols work because they give us something to manipulate visibly that corresponds to an underlying reality. Now you might be thinking to yourself, well, that's just an instance of the placebo effect. And you wouldn't be wrong if that's what you're thinking, but how well do we really understand the placebo effect and why this happens? Various suggestions have been put forward, but placebo research is still really in its infancy. So some of the explanations include a release of endogenous opioids in the body of the patient, reduction of stress, which perhaps somehow restores the body to more optimal functioning. Somehow placebo seems to relate to interpretation of stimuli and expectations, or what Daniel Norman has termed the meaning response, and he argues that that might be a better term than placebo effect because it shows that there are nuances to what is meaningful to people in a particular context, and that their bodies will respond to that meaning perhaps in different ways. The term meaning response is useful because it reminds us that the way the body responds to symbols or placebo substances is in large part dependent on the social or cultural meaning that we have learned to ascribe to particular symbols. For example, red pills have been shown in scientific studies to be more effective stimulants than blue pills, even when they both contain inert substances, biologically inert substances. Why would that be the case? In many societies, including our own, we have learned to associate the color red with aggression, action, excitement, hunger even. But an exception to this trend was found in Italy, where blue pills were more stimulating. Now, it just so happens that blue is the color of the extremely popular national soccer team of Italy. So maybe that has something to do with the reason why red versus blue has a different outcome in that particular cultural context. I really highly recommend watching the film Placebo Cracking the Code, and I've put a link to that in your list of additional recommended readings and resources, which discusses these and other ways in which researchers are beginning to understand the complex relationships between culture, belief, and healing. Religious faith is also discussed in the film, as is the nocebo effect. Now, turning to chapter 4 in your textbook, Edgar turns this line of analysis, in which we're thinking about ethnomedical systems of health, to the area of mental and psychiatric health. What defines a mental or psychiatric illness? When there's a deviation from what is considered to be normal behavior, emotional and cognitive states, then a mental illness is defined within a particular ethnomedical system. But what exactly is to be considered a normal behavior and mental state? Your textbook goes through a number of different examples that show this is highly contingent on social and cultural factors. Perhaps one of the most surprising examples was the condition of drapetomania, which was defined by the 19th century physician Samuel Cartwright as the disease causing Negroes to run away. it's kind of overwhelming and shocking today to think about the decision to run away for a slave to make as being a sign of a mental illness, or even defining an illness in and of itself. But the social conditions of slavery that would have made this tendency an entirely rational decision, while seeming obvious today, were defined as a mental disorder because it fit with Cartwright's cultural values, in which slavery was viewed as part of the divine order. See if you can think of any diagnostic categories in use today that might reflect cultural values as much as biological disturbances. Edgar spends a good deal of time discussing conditions from the DSM-IV, which was a publication of the American Psychiatric Association, used to classify and diagnose mental health conditions in the United States and Western biomedicine. And shortly after the textbook was published, this volume was superseded by DSM-V, which critics have said goes even further, perhaps, in medicalizing patterns of behavior and mood that aren't really particularly extreme. Furthermore, critics have argued that the pharmaceutical industry had an undue influence on the disease classification process, because 2/3 of the task force who developed the revised manual had direct links to the pharmaceutical industry. So in its crudest formulation, this argument says that the so-called psychiatric problems were defined in such a way as to increase demand for the drugs that are marketed to treat them. There's a short NHS Choices article that I've linked on the Moodle page for you, which offers a UK perspective on this edition of the manual and gives you a little bit more detail of those arguments I've just outlined. Now, this is not to say that psychiatric illness is not real, or that there are no conditions that can be universally understood as abnormal. Edgar argues that two classifications in particular, in the form of depression-like symptoms and schizophrenia, are conditions that appear to be universally present across cultures. And science has shown that there are at least some biochemical and genetic bases for both of these conditions. However, the ways that they're manifested and treated or not might vary from culture to culture and form part of an ethnomedical or even ethnopsychiatric system. This photograph documents a groundbreaking trial of a community-based treatment for people with schizophrenia in India. Now, the DSM-IV recognized that there are certain constellations of abnormal behavior that are only seen in certain cultural contexts. And it provided an appendix listing these conditions as culture-bound syndromes. So these were defined as recurrent, locality-specific patterns of aberrant behavior and troubling experience that may or may not be linked to a particular DSM-IV diagnostic category. Many of these patterns are indigenously considered to be illnesses or afflictions, and most have local names. So these descriptions are reproduced in box 4.1 of your textbook. It's quite interesting to read some of them. For example, Pibloktok is an abrupt dissociative episode of frenzied excitement, frequently followed by convulsive seizures and coma, observed primarily in Arctic and subarctic Eskimo communities. Now, it is useful to recognize that culture plays an important role in the manifestation of mental distress and aberration. Certainly, it's interesting to read about some of these culture-bound syndromes, but this treatment has been critiqued for its portrayal of culture as something exotic, something that only affects other people. So therefore, these culture-bound syndromes were just found in the appendix of the manual, whereas the mental disorders recognized in our own culture form the main body. If we take the view that all humans, including ourselves, are cultural, and that troubling experiences or mental states might reflect stress, then we might assume that most of the conditions referred to as culture-bound syndromes or the outcome of particular kinds of social stressors that are present in the cultures in which they are experienced. Now, the updated manual, DSM-5, takes a more nuanced or sensitive approach to culture. Instead of updating, it has updated the criteria to reflect cross-cultural variations in presentations of the illness classifications described in the main body of the manual. It gives information about cultural concepts of distress and provides interview tools which are intended to empower clinicians to undertake person-centered, culturally sensitive assessments. So as we've seen, culture is integral to defining systems of disease and illness within a framework that categorizes states of being. And culture is also involved in the assignment of values, moral values, to the disease or illness categories. The ethnomedical systems intersect with other key cultural domains like the moral domain, cultural constructs of the individual, assigning responsibility for personal health. And an ethnomedical system also intersects with the various social divisions that exist, including gender, social class systems of social stratification, race, etc. So culture can be said to help define normal versus abnormal, good versus bad, and so on. And those divisions within a cultural context are typically accepted as natural. They almost exist below the conscious level. We don't think about what's normal and what's abnormal. We just recognize abnormal when we see it for our particular cultural context. And when an illness phenomenon is classed as abnormal, it might also be classified as abnormal but okay, but morally okay. That is, it's not your fault that you got the flu. Or abnormal but not morally okay, your fault or somebody else's fault. If you got the flu because it just happened, or because you work with children and that's a valued social role, then okay, it's not your fault. But if you got the flu because you were insisting on being outdoors without a coat, then perhaps there's some moral judgment and you'll have less sympathy in your sick role. For the latter category, stigma will be the result. The culturally patterned moral connections to illness may be particularly strong in cultures that ascribe a high value to individual autonomy and responsibility. Individuals then are held accountable for their behavior that is viewed as having caused them to become sick. And we see this in a lot of contemporary public health discourse. We might be aiming to encourage people to take responsibility for their health and implement personal behavior changes. But there could be an implication then that if their behavior doesn't change, that the health outcomes are their fault, or that they are individually responsible for illnesses that might occur. This phenomenon is also at work in cultural narratives that see illness as divine or personal retribution for an offense that the patient might have committed in the past. Even in the New Testament, we see that there was a dominant social assumption that people were sick because they had sinned. For example, think about the story in John chapter 9, when a man who had been born blind was brought to Jesus. And what did his disciples ask him? They wanted to know who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind. It must be somebody's fault. There must be a moral blame attached to this man's blindness. On the other hand, we can also find moral narratives that blame illness on social divisions, circumstances, or the behavior of others. Living in an inequitable society where some people are oppressed and impoverished and may have to live with environmental pollution caused by the more powerful members of society. These have been shown repeatedly to be associated with illness. So many activists and others have called for a moral judgment against these unjust social structures. Sometimes the physical manifestation of a disease itself results in the disease coming to symbolize something. That is, if the disease looks like the embodiment of a culturally defined malevolence of some kind. People might react to it regardless of whether or not the victim is initially held to be at fault. One of the classic cases of this kind of stigma is the disease of leprosy. And this woman in this photograph suffers from leprosy, which has been stigmatized for thousands of years around the world. Biologically, it's a chronic communicable disease, although it requires a very long period of exposure and has a very long incubation period also, affecting the skin, the eyes, the internal organs, the peripheral nerves, mucous membranes. It's caused by bacteria with some sort of genetic susceptibility possibly involved as well. Over a long history, it's become a terribly stigmatized disease, so much so that the generic term leper now simply refers to people who have been shunned for various reasons. But why and how did leprosy become such a legendary stigmatized condition, not just another disease? Now, interestingly, while leprosy has been a classic case of stigma for 1,000 years, leprosy is actually not universally stigmatized. And this can be seen by examining the experience of leprosy across cultures, where the nature of the disease itself is a constant, but the social response is not. And in your textbook, you read about the comparison made by Waxler, who compared leprosy in India, Sri Lanka, and Nigeria, and the development of the stigma in Hawaii also. Where in India, lepers in the city who are from rural areas never return home due to the stigma and often become beggars. They'd be cut out of their inheritance. Doctors refuse to treat them very often. They can't get insurance. Sometimes they would even be forcibly divorced. And this treatment of people with leprosy is even supported by the law. In Sri Lanka, which is very close to India, it's an island to the south and east of the Indian subcontinent, the experience is very different. So leprosy is still feared, but victims don't lose their jobs and families, and yet stigma does still exist, so that lepers often learn to withdraw themselves from extensive social contact and so forth. In Nigeria, leprosy is prevalent among the Hausa people, who are Muslim people living in the northern part of the country. And the cause of leprosy is said to include gluttony, swearing falsely by the Quran, or washing in the water that a leprosy patient has used. Various treatments are proposed, including burning and scraping the skin, but fundamentally, leprosy is viewed as just one disease among many diseases that people can have, so it's not particularly stigmatized. And then finally, in the example of Hawaii, there's been a severe reaction and even quarantining of people with leprosy, which coincided with a rapid increase in the Chinese population due to immigration to work on plantations. So because there was racism and possibly economic animosity for the Chinese among Americans in Hawaii, the Chinese likely became a scapegoat, and leprosy was basically the tool for the exercise of this racism. And finally, your textbook describes at some length the stigma surrounding HIV and AIDS. And Edberg points out that even more than leprosy, HIV and AIDS hits at some very basic cultural, social, and political issues and affects some of the most vulnerable members of society. So what are these basic cultural, social, and political issues? Well, because promiscuity, and in some cases homosexual promiscuity in particular, prostitution, and drug use were implicated in the spread of the disease, individual behavior and moral failures have often been blamed. Now, these behaviors are associated with the spread of HIV and AIDS, but that has the kind of moral fear around the disease itself has been very, very significant in the treatment of HIV as a sort of plague or as a very stigmatized condition. Fear of AIDS tapped into cultural fears of the other. Gay men, drug addicts, inner-city ethnics, Haitians, Africans, and so on. And because there are significant social structural problems associated with such factors as drug use, as poor women resorting to prostitution when there were few other economic options, and a global economic structure that meant that anti-HIV drugs were not always available to the poor who needed them the most, the wealthy and powerful in the United States have also been blamed for the spread of the disease. So this is a classic example of the process of othering, in which the qualities of one group are contrasted with another. We have an us and a them. You are with us or you're against us. You're friends or enemies, citizens or aliens, and so forth. This is clearly related to the stigmatization of certain illnesses, and it also impacts on the social structure. Othering creates a moral justification for discriminating between approved and marginalized groups, which in turn creates conditions that impact on the trajectory of a disease, the path it takes in a particular social or cultural group. So as Edberg argues at the end of chapter 5, when illness stigma is woven within the structure of society, those who are stigmatized are often marginalized, cut off from the system of supports that amplifies health risk, resulting in an unnecessary and negative trajectory of illness. Okay, this module has covered a tremendous amount of ground, from the description of ethnomedical systems as systems that define what it means to be ill, what causes illness, and what's to be done about it, to the relationship between belief, illness, and healing practice, cultural definitions of mental health and illness, and moral dimensions of how illness is viewed and perhaps stigmatized within a society. The important messages for public health practice are that illness is to a large degree culturally constructed, and we need to understand how an illness experience is understood and dealt with in its cultural context, but also that we must work to reduce stigma and moral judgments against the sick in order to promote health and a just society. And I'm just going to leave you with this quote from Dr. Paul Farmer, who is a physician anthropologist. He founded the organization Partners in Health, who says, "The idea that some lives matter less is the root of all that is wrong with the world." I look forward to hearing your responses to some of what you've encountered in this week's module. There's a lot of really, not necessarily conceptually difficult, but sometimes quite personally challenging material that we've dealt with and addressed in this module. So I want to leave you with the time to mull over that and reflect on it for your reflective journal writing. Thank you.